In 1939, design work began on another new light cruiser class. Whereas the Aganos were meant to replace the 5,500-tonners as destroyer squadron leaders, these ships were meant to be submarine squadron leaders. Since, in accordance with the Great Decisive Battle strategy, submarines were meant to operate far ahead of the fleet, potentially in hostile waters, this required a ship with long range, high speed, good anti-aircraft, and most importantly, the ability to operate a useful number of reconnaissance planes that could scout in enemy-controlled skies. Thus was started the 8,164-ton Oyodo class. Originally 8 were to have been built, but as Japan's limited shipbuilding capacity was focused on carriers and destroyers, this was soon scaled back to 2, then finally to 1. Below the flush main deck, she was essentially a repeat of the Aganos. Above, though, she was quite different. The main armament, like the Tones, was grouped forward. This was because, like the Tones, her main guns, indeed all of her armament, was essentially considered secondary. She was meant to operate outside of the fleet, deep in enemy-controlled waters. They were essentially there for defense if she was forced to fight rather than for seeking battle. As such, she had no need for torpedoes and didn't carry them. Armor was also scaled down compared to the Aganos. Like the Tones, her, quote, main armament was her scouting float planes. To that end, the rear third, rear half if you include the hangar, was dedicated to operate up to 6 of the still under development Kawanishi E-15K Shiun reconnaissance float planes. These were large and heavy planes, so she was fitted with an especially large catapult to launch them. She was also fitted with a series of rails to move them around. In the event, though, the Shiun was a failure, having multiple problems with its floats, and she never operated more than 2 of them in an experimental capacity. Instead, she was used first as a regular light cruiser, carrying a pair of regular float planes, then converted into the combined fleet's flagship. Oyodo was started February 14, 1941, and completed February 28, 1943. Main armament was 6 155mm 60 caliber guns and 2 triple turrets forward of the bridge. These were the same guns and turrets that had been mounted on the Mogami class before they were rearmed and were the secondaries on the Yamato class battleship. The 155mm 60 caliber triple mount weighed 180 metric tons. Rate of fire was 5 rounds per minute per gun, and the guns were individually sleeved. Training speed was 6 degrees per second, and elevation was 10 degrees per second up to 55 degrees. Loading was at 5 degrees. Maximum range was 27,400 meters. The shells were 55.87 kilograms with a bursting charge of 3.1 kilograms. They used 1 powder bag. Secondary armament was 8 of the new 100mm 65 caliber dual-purpose guns in 4 twin mounts, 2 on each side midship. Propulsion was provided by 6 boilers venting to the 2 trunked funnels. These provided steam to the 4 turbines, generating 110,000 horsepower, each of which drove one of her 4 propellers for a top speed of 35 knots. She had 1 rudder. Protection was thin. A 60mm belt protected the engine rooms, thickening to 75mm aside the main guns. The main armored deck was 28mm over the engine rooms, thickening to 30mm over the funnels and 50mm over the magazines. The ends of the armored box were formed by bulkheads 60mm thick forward and 35mm aft. Barbette armor was 20mm and turret armor was 25mm. Modifications were pretty light. Soon after completion in April of 1943, Type 21 radar was fitted. In March of 1944, with the canceling of the float plane and the changing strategic situation, she was converted into the fleet's flagship. Her large catapult was replaced with a smaller one for 2 regular float planes. The hangar was converted into cruise quarters, and the cruise quarters were converted into the fleet's staff's quarters. Type 22 radar was also fitted. Oyodo joined the fleet at the start of May 1943 and almost immediately joined the fleet, forming up to head north to interdict the American liberation of Attu. When Attu fell before they could arrive, she returned to Japan with the rest of the fleet. In mid-July, loaded with troops and supplies, she sailed with the other large ships first to Rabaul, then to Truk, arriving at the end of the month. In September and October, she sailed with the fleet trying to intercept American carriers launching training raids on the Gilberts, Marshalls, and Wake. Both times, they were too late and had to return to Truk empty-handed. In late December 1943 through early January 1943, she escorted a convoy that ran supplies to the Northern Solomons before returning to Truk. While doing so, she was attacked by American aircraft and slightly damaged. In mid-February of 1944, while most of the surface fleet abandoned Truk and transferred to the East Indies, she returned to Japan for overhaul and conversion. There she stayed as the fleet's headquarters ship until October of 1944, missing the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On October 20th, she sailed as part of the Decoy Northern Force and took part in the Battle of Cape Engano. During the attack, she was near-missed several times and hit by rockets and a bomb that damaged one of her boiler rooms. A few days later, she was back in Japan. At the end of October, she left Japan on a ferry run that took her first to Manila, then on to Singapore, where she arrived in the middle of November. After moving things around the East Indies, in late December, her group headed to Mindoro to attack American forces landing at San Jose. Upon arrival at San Jose, her group attacked American forces landing there and was in turn attacked by American aircraft and PTs. At the Battle of San Jose, sometimes called the San Jose Intrusion, Oyodo was hit by 2 bombs. Luckily for her, one was a dud and the other did only minor damage. After shelling the beachhead, she and her battered force returned to the East Indies, arriving at the end of the month for repairs. There she stayed until the start of February 1945 when, loaded with raw materials, her and her force made their way back to Japan, arriving near the end of the month. Once there, with little fuel and air cover, like the other tattered remains of the Navy, she was essentially relegated to a floating anti-aircraft platform, awaiting the inevitable airstrikes. And come they did. On March 19th, in preparation for the invasion of Okinawa, American carriers raided Japan. Oyodo was hit by 3 bombs and had to be beached to avoid sinking. By the end of the month, she was dry docked, and by mid-April, she was mostly repaired. On July 24th, she was attacked again, suffering several hits and near misses that left her listing to starboard. 4 days later, between 10 a.m. and noon, she was attacked again. After being hit several times, she capsized to starboard and sunk in the mud of the harbor. Post-war, she was raised and scrapped.